Okay, so we're looking at the British Empire this week and the way that Victorian England connected with the rest of the world. If you think about Japan at this time, it was just coming out of its Sakoku period, and so there are huge differences between the way that the two cultures, the two societies were developing at this stage. So let's take a look. The idea of imperialism, which is central, really, to the way that society was developing at that time. Basically, yes, this was the time when the empire was at its height. Now, if we go back to the 16th century, there wasn't even a Britain, not in a political sense. Britain is something that's grown up over the centuries. Well, I better turn that off. Yeah, Britain's grown up over the centuries. England and Wales, if you go back to the early 16th century, England and Wales were united, but Scotland was a separate country. And this carried on. During the 17th century, the two countries, Scotland and England, became much closer because the King of England was also Scottish. The Stuart dynasty was a Scottish family. This is because Henry VIII's sister had gone and married a Scottish king. And eventually, their descendants, became kings and queens later on of England. And Ireland only became formally part of the United Kingdom in 1800, 100 years or so after Scotland had united, but it was more or less effectively under English control, well, arguably from late Tudor times on, even under Queen Elizabeth. In the later 16th century, Ireland was to a large extent under English control. By the time you get to the 17th century, you've got Oliver Cromwell basically taking complete control and doing what he wants in Ireland. And so also the 16th century will be the time when colonies in America and other places began to be established, although they weren't really successful. The early colonies weren't really successful, but by the early 17th century, you started to get colonies that are growing up, and the empire is slowly getting started. And as time goes by, we find that the wars between European countries are more and more, they're about controlling the markets, controlling the trading routes, controlling those parts of the world where the new crops and new products are being grown, where they're coming from. And so war ceases to be fighting for territory inside Europe, and is fighting for control of various parts of the world. And during the 18th century, the century before Dickens, Britain's main enemy was France, and after a series of wars, most of them with France, Britain emerged as basically the most powerful country in Europe and a major world power with an empire that stretched across the world. They used to say the sun never sets on the British Empire. There's always some part of it that is, it's daytime. If it's nighttime in one part of the empire, it's daytime in another part. So I'll show you that diagrammatically in a little minute. By 1753, there was a series of wars And at the end of those wars in 1753, England, which by now we can call Britain because it is united with Scotland, and Wales and England and Scotland are together as one country. Britain had got the best of its European rivals, and it was in control of an empire. So looking at it diagrammatically, if you go, in terms of a map and showing the layout of it all, if you go to the start of the Tudor period, at the beginning, start of the Tudor period, late 15th century, England had control over Wales and a little bit of Ireland. Okay? It was just a small country on the edge of Europe of no particular importance, really. Okay? So, from those beginnings, we move on to the middle of the 17th century, when England had control over Scotland and Ireland, and basically the whole of those islands, the British Isles, Britain and Ireland, was under English control. And we're also seeing colonies in quite distant parts of the world. All right, we've already got these colonies in America, in Africa, and in India. And that's going back as far as the middle of the 17th century. And then over the next 100 years, you're seeing, if you look at the map, you can see a small growth. It doesn't look like all that much in terms of territory. The land is not increasing all that much, but infrastructure, consolidating those bases, building towns, making ports and harbours for ships and so on, that was all moving on very fast. So although the growth in territory doesn't look all that much, this was really a big step forward. Yes, latecomers, there are prints at the front here. Okay, and so this would be the way that it looked in 1754. It doesn't look all that much different from the way it looked in the middle of the 17th century, but the power base has got much stronger. And then we see the explosion of control of territory, of actual land. Or we will do if I can get the PowerPoint functioning properly. If we look at the early 20th century, that was when, in terms of land controlled by the British, the early 20th century, at the very end of the Victorian period, the beginning of the 20th century, that was when the empire controlled its maximum amount of territory, land. And that's really a substantial amount of the planet which is under British control just 100 years ago. And the map doesn't really show, perhaps what was the most important secret of the British Empire. You might be able to see some little dots of red here. Okay, but these islands that were under British control were hugely important because that meant that British ships could stop anywhere and get goods and refuel and could kind of get more food on board or get new people working, new crews or anything like that. The message was, rule Britannia, Britannia, rule the waves. Britannia, rule the waves. It was an empire that was based on control of the sea. Okay, so yes, just seeing the huge amount of land that was controlled doesn't really give the whole message. At that time, transport was by sea, and Britain controlled a huge number of little islands, and even today still keeps control of some of those islands. If you look at where we are today, though, it's all gone. All right, somewhere in the middle of the 20th century, basically mostly after World War II, Britain found that it had run out of money and wasn't able to keep an empire going, and lost it, or lost most of it, nearly all of it. We'll look at the sense in which it kept it. It looks like the wheel's gone round, you know, completely. Most of Ireland, for example, is independent. So Britain, you know, the United Kingdom does not include most of Ireland, which is an independent country. There was a referendum in Scotland a couple of years ago, which was voting for independence, and I think because of economics, the Scottish people voted to stay inside the United Kingdom. But, you know, Scotland could get lost. All right, so things could go back almost really to where they were at the beginning. And there are just a few remote islands and overseas territories and British possessions. You can see them on the map there. All right, these little islands. They may not seem, you know, particularly important today, but they were important enough that, for example, the largest of them, the Falkland Islands, were the cause of a war. In the late 20th century, Margaret Thatcher sent ships over to protect it from an invasion by nearby Argentina. So they're still of some strategic importance. They're also, some of them, used as tax havens where the very rich can put their money in banks that won't get checked by the British authorities. And there's a scandal about that. You know, you've heard about this, the Panama Papers recently. They're connected with some of these places, some of these areas. The only one I've personally been to was Gibraltar up here in Spain. I didn't like it at all. I love Spain very much, but I wasn't very happy with Gibraltar. It seemed to be full of smugglers and criminals and had a rather nasty atmosphere. So I'm not really sure these little bits that are left over of the British Empire. But there is something else that's very important that's left over from that empire, which I think I will talk about. It's not 19th century, it's a modern thing. It's the Commonwealth of Nations. And it's something that Japanese people very often don't know anything about, so I just thought I'd throw it in here. It's a group of countries that used to belong to the British Empire, and they keep up their cultural and, to some extent, political and economic relations with the United Kingdom, with Britain, even today. You'll notice that there are two countries here. Zimbabwe was kicked out, Tobasareta, because of human rights problems. Not kicked out by the British, kicked out by the group. Okay, the British don't control this group. Okay, and Ireland is also marked in red because Ireland chose to leave. And by the time we finish these lectures, you'll probably understand why Ireland chose to leave. They had a particularly bad experience. They've had perhaps of all of those countries, they had the worst experience of the British. And you can see that there's quite a close relationship between the countries which were the British Empire and the countries which are now the Commonwealth. All right? Basically, there's quite a strong crossover there. Most of the countries that were in the Empire are also in the Commonwealth. Okay? Research the Commonwealth if you're interested at all. As I say, it's something that Japanese people very often don't know anything about because it doesn't really, you know, Japan's outside all of that. You hear about, you know, United Nations, you hear about America, but the fact that there's a British Commonwealth and that it has, is even today quite strong connections between these countries. For example, India has huge connections with Britain. There are about 1.5 million Indian people living in Britain today. There's a tremendous amount of trade going on between the two countries. So it really, this empire started and ended as a trading empire. So the British Commonwealth kind of gives you some sense of that, and also of the cultural links between these countries. Okay, so As I say, it's a trading empire. It's all about economics, really, in the end. As I say, it was Britain was competing with other European countries, and the markets were, well, the new markets that were springing up were for goods like tobacco, sugar, tea, coffee, cotton. Right? Cotton was later going to become very important during the Industrial Revolution. Spices, tropical fruits, these were the markets that were opening up. Okay, the British people, the Europeans generally have been only eating, of course, what they could grow themselves. Now we get a whole new set of products, and there's a high demand for them. The whole way in which British society developed, and the fact that it had its Industrial Revolution and all of those things, it's all very closely connected with these markets. So the British Empire would be really basically important if you're going to look at the way that society developed, and also, of course, the fact that I'm here today talking to you in English, and that universities all over Japan and all over the world are using English, not just universities, but societies are using English as a common language. It all goes back to the fact that they had this empire, and the reason they had the empire was mostly because of trade and goods. And, people were, branching up. Society was moving into a consumer society, a society that was based on people smoking things and drinking things and putting expensive spices on things and so on. And these consumer markets were what were being fed by the empire. And you get things like coffee houses and tea shops, and they changed the way that people interacted in society. You didn't have those kinds of gathering places in the 16th century. They grew up over the 17th and 18th centuries, and they were very, very important to the way in which the society was developing, because the first, newspapers, for example, people would sit in the coffee houses, they would be reading the newspapers, they would discuss things together. They were meeting places for people to talk about things, and of course to form companies like the Bank of England, which was founded in 1694. You get the supply of raw cotton, which is, as I said before, was very, very important because it transformed the clothing industry, and it led to the cotton mills of the Industrial Revolution. And the London Stock Exchange, formally founded in 1801. Now the London Stock Exchange, long before it was formally founded in 1801, again, based on coffee shops and people meeting and talking, there was a kind of informal, well, not informal, but a precursor to the stock exchange. Before the stock exchange as we know it today came into existence, there was plenty of buying and selling of stocks going on all through the 18th century. So there's one huge market that I haven't mentioned so far: the slave trade. And the slave trade was a so-called triangular system of trade, so that Britain would be exporting alcohol and manufactured goods, including things like weapons, but clothing and cheap clothing and so on, like things like that. Taking those things to Africa, exchanging those for slaves who were taken to the Americas, and those slaves would be exchanged again for goods, for high-priced luxury goods, which would be shipped then back to Britain. And a single successful trip could make a person's fortune. And don't ask too much about the very, very rich in Britain today. Not all of them, of course, but some of them, their ancestors were involved in that slave trade, and that's how they got rich. So it was a time when people could make fortunes. And just take a look at that. Triangular trade system, okay? Textiles, rum, alcohol, manufactured goods being taken to Africa. Remember, the main colony was sort of tucked away under here at that time, although later on British control extended over large parts of Africa. But that was after the period of slavery. So this is the main picking up point for slaves. Then the slaves would be taken off to the Americas here, where they would be sold either in mainland America or in the Caribbean islands. And then they would be taken, then they would be exchanged for these goods like sugar and tobacco and things like that. Slavery was abolished in 1833 in all parts of the empire, but by this time the British Empire was, it was the most powerful political entity in the world. And, okay. What sort of ideas did the British have about their empire? What did they think they were doing? I mean, yes, a lot of it was based on getting money, making a fortune, getting rich. All right, that would be part of it. But also the patriotic spirit, the sense of, as I said, rule Britannia, this very famous song, rule Britannia, Britannia rule. I can't sing, sorry. Britannia rule the waves, Britons never, never shall be slaves. Sense of national pride, but also a kind of religious spirit that actually this is what we are. God has a purpose, and we are acting out God's purpose on this planet. So the most important duties were to God and country. That would be the way that people saw their lives, that they were there to serve their God and to serve their country. And as I say, they believed that God had chosen the country, that God had a purpose there. All right, there was still a sort of belief, which probably societies today, most societies don't have, that there was a sort of divine heavenly purpose for human society. So behind that, there's a form of prejudice, a sabetsu, a racism, because the idea is that foreigners were less advanced. We are leading because we are the leaders. God has looked down and seen, the British are the best. Let's put them in the position of controlling an empire that spreads, across the world. So along with that, of course, comes another idea different from the buying and selling and the merchant aspect of the empire, is the idea that Britain has a duty to civilize everybody else. Okay? It must be God's purpose to want them to be Christians. It must be God's purpose to want them to have our kind of society. And so there was a kind of tension growing up between those people who were looking at the empire in terms of let's get rich and make profit out of it and buy and sell what we can, and those who are seeing it as a kind of I'm not saying that they were right in their way of thinking, but in their own minds they were altruistic. It's our duty. I mean, it's what we've got to do. We've got to go and teach these poor people, the benefits of our science, our technology, our health treatment, our education, and of course, maybe topping the list for a lot of people, our religion. Okay, I mean, the society was still basically very Christian. So there was a sort of tension between the people who were regarding the empire as a place for, to get rich and make a profit, and those who were looking at it as, oh, it's our duty to go and spread our culture. So a good example of that would be St. John Rivers. Notice, although it says St. John, his name is St. John. That's pronounced St. John. St. John Rivers in Charlotte Bronte's Jane Eyre. He's an English missionary. His aim, he's a good man who wants to give his life to saving the souls of people in, far-off countries, bringing them the word of Christ, bringing them Christianity. He sees it as his moral duty. It's what he has to spend his life doing. Right? He's not out to get rich. He's not going to get rich. He's not making money out of it. He's sacrificing his life. He's giving his life over to spreading what he sees as God's word, and he sees it as his duty to do that. On the other hand, you've got in Dickens's Bleak House, you've got Mrs. Jellyby. And she is also altruistic in a sense, but she is satirized by Dickens. She is not presented positively. She is one of these people who, it was called telescope philanthropy. You look after what's a long way away. You say, oh, those poor starving children in Africa. But she doesn't look after her own children. Okay, she doesn't look after the people around her. It's all geared towards helping people who are in faraway, distant places. There was a kind of feeling, again, about, and Dickens is worried about this. As you know, Dickens could see so much poverty going on in London, where he was. What's all this about our duty to the rest of the world? We've got people suffering here. We've got problems at home. Okay, and pretty clearly, his focus is on the suffering that's going on close at hand. So he's critical of people like Mrs. Jellyby, who are insisting that we've got to give all our energies to civilizing and helping and benefiting people in distant countries. Telescopic philanthropy. Okay, it's there. And the little boy is saying, please, aren't I black enough to be cared for? Because I'm not black, are you not going to care for me? Okay, that's, you've got enough poor little children on the streets of England or Britain or the United Kingdom generally, but Britannia, okay, notice this is not just a woman here, this is symbolizing Britannia, the country. All right, Britannia is a symbol of Britain. She's looking out to distant shores, all right, to this supposed duty to look after and benefit the poor of other countries. So Dickens's Mrs. Jellyby is typical of that sort of telescopic philanthropy, as it was called, and we get Rudyard Kipling's famous poem, The White Man's Burden, which I will come back to later on. When this presentation finishes, we'll take a little look separately at The White Man's Burden. And it really expresses the idea that this kind of philanthropy is pointless. It's pointless. He's very cynical. These people don't want what you're offering. They're not going to appreciate what you're offering. And he's not very complimentary about it. It's like they're too ignorant. They're too wild. They're not interested in civilization. They're savages. All right. The poem is quite racist. Okay. And this is a tension that's going on in Victorian England between the sense of patriotic duty towards the rest of the world, and coupled with the sense of looking down on the rest of the world, looking down on them and saying, well, we should help to pick them up, but looking down on them and saying, no, it's not worth lifting them up. All right? But notice, in both cases, looking down. There's a sense of cultural superiority that the Victorians are absolutely confident that they are the world's leading country. And as a character in Our Mutual Friend by Charles Dickens says, basically he feels that other countries are a mistake. It's an unfortunate thing that there are other countries. Why can't the world just be us? So all these attitudes share one thing, the assumption that Britain is advanced and the rest of the world is primitive. So whether it's St. John Rivers going to save these poor souls, or whether it's Mrs. Jellyby on a crusade, or whether it's Kipling insisting that these people are heathen, primitive, and don't deserve to be helped, always there's that basic assumption that the white man, and particularly the English man, is superior. Britain's role is to give and to teach. There's no idea, really, that it has anything to learn from the rest of the world. Arrogant might be a way of putting it, okay? Unoboreta. So, but that was just sort of atarimae. We've got an empire all over the world. We must be the best. Okay, so that was the feeling that people had. Okay, so next step in this presentation would be the idea of colonialism. Setting up colonies, British people living outside Britain, living all over the world. So trading was important, but you've also got the spreading of the British and the Irish people through the possibility of going and living in these colonies. The first colony, the first successful colony, the one that lasted, others before that just died out. They didn't continue. But Jamestown, Virginia, 1609, there were a few hundred English people. They got through the first winter just about. Only 1 in 5 of them survived. But still, the following year there were still some of them there. And they moved on from that, and slaves were taken from Africa in 1619. This whole thing was beginning, okay? The slave triangle was beginning in the early 17th century. This was kind of getting started. I should mention for Disney fans especially that the founder of the colony is famous for his marriage to Pocahontas, the daughter of a Native American chief. Okay, I think some of you might know the Disney movie, or I don't know, maybe have you heard of Pocahontas? Yeah, I think she's famous. So that's where she comes in. Okay. And this would be the way that colony looked originally. Or sorry, not originally, really by the after 80 or 90 years, it was a fairly settled kind of colony. Although in the end they moved it somewhere else because it wasn't on good ground. But that was the first successful colony set up in the 70s. Okay, so moving on then. Australia, once America became independent, Australia became the kind of main destination for British people who were leaving their country to go to other parts of the empire. there was a very famous man called Captain James Cook, and he had travelled to Australia and claimed the east coast for Britain, and the colony was set up in the later part of the 18th century. Things moved pretty quickly from there, and there were both regular colonization and penal colonies for criminals, and quite a lot of those freed convicts, after they'd spent their time in a penal colony, they would settle in Australia and carry on and make their new lives there. And Dickens writes a lot about this, quite a lot, particularly in terms of the penal colonies. We've got John Edmonds in Pickwick Papers, we've got Squeers in Nicholas Nickleby, Uriah Heep in David Copperfield, and Magwitch in Great Expectations, perhaps the most famous of all of them. These are all mentioned in connection with having been sent to Australia. Magwitch, of course, returns from his period as a convict. And there are several other characters in David Copperfield who go to Australia, not just Uriah Heep, who is sent as a convict, but other characters like Mr. Micawber, the Peggotties. The message that Dickens seems to be giving out here is that people who are not successful in Britain have a sort of second chance. They can go to Australia, or they could go to another country. In Great Expectations too, we get Pip and his friend Herbert working for a company. This sort of thing happening in various countries of the British Empire, so that there was a sense that, well, particularly in David Copperfield, a sense that if you were not successful in your own country, you could have a sort of second chance. So that, for example, Mr. Micawber, he has not been able to find work in England, and he can't support his family properly, but he leaves for Australia, and he makes a name for himself and becomes a magistrate there. And Martha loses her bad name because she has been involved in a scandal with Steerforth, David's old school friend, who is a high-class gentleman, and she has run off with him. And the scandal involved in that makes life difficult for her in England, so she can lose her bad name by going off to Australia, where she can find a husband in a country where nobody knows her reputation. Okay, so yes, I've been talking so far about the white colonies, where the white people are the majority, or they're in control. Basically, it's a white society. But of course, other parts of the empire were very different. Basically, Australia, New Zealand, places like that, the native societies were overwhelmed and to a large extent destroyed. But in other situations, the local inhabitants would be the majority, or in the case of some of the Caribbean territories, they may not be the native inhabitants, but they would be a non-white population that had grown up in those areas. Look at some of those situations. I'll take India and Jamaica as the two main ones. India was the most treasured colonial possession. It was controlled by the East India Company, and then it was controlled by the British Crown before becoming independent in 1947. And even before the East India Company had control in 1757, even before that, the East Indian Company was controlling or running trade in quite significant areas of India. And as I said, even today, it's a strong relationship with about 1.5 million people of Indian origin living in Britain and large-scale investment on both sides. And this would also, the Caribbean would be another area where the British were in control. And in this case, it's a question of large numbers of Africans who were taken there as slaves, and then by Victorian times they'd been made free, but some of them obviously continued to work for their former slave masters, but now they were the relationship changed. And of course, the British presence in Africa in general increased hugely in the 19th century. So let's just take a look at how, Britain interacted with those kinds of societies. If we start with India, the French were pushed out, basically. Before being controlled by the British, many parts of India had been controlled by the French, and the mid-period, or just slightly beyond the middle of the 18th century, was the period when Britain fought the French and took control of India. And it was a sort of adventure playground, really. As you can see from this, there's quite a lot of interaction here, isn't there? There's cockfighting, which was a bloody horrible sport. People would gamble on which of the animals would die first as they fought each other. They would put special sharp spurs on their claws so they would kill each other, and they would gamble on it. But there's quite a lot of sort of, it's a master-servant relationship, but there's quite a lot of sort of mixing. It's sort of very male. You'll notice that you're not going to see white women here in this society at this stage, or very few of them, all right? It's very male, and it's mostly people who would go there, spend a few years there, and then go back to their own country later on, if they didn't die there. Some of these tropical colonies became known as white man's graveyard because of the diseases that people would easily catch and so on. But it was a place to go to have a sort of adventure, really. But by the middle of the Victorian period, it's changed quite considerably. And you've got colonial officials, you've got their wives, you've got a fairly formal relationship with the Indian people, who are very much in a sort of master-servant kind of relationship. But of course, slavery would not really be going on, slavery was not really a part of the British presence in India, right? So it was a different kind of relationship. Slavery was never really on the agenda here. I may be wrong about that to some extent, but it was not a major thing. There may have been some people who were put into slavery in India in the 18th century, but it would be, compared with what was going on in the Caribbean, it was very small scale. So it's a sort of master-servant relationship, but not involving slavery. If we look in the Caribbean, of course, well, the pattern follows the same as the east coast of America, but that became independent in the 18th century. And basically what was happening here was that the native populations weren't suitable to do the kind of work that the white people wanted them to do for various reasons. And so black people were imported from Africa. Jamaica is a good example. Again, like India had been a French colony, Jamaica had been Spanish before it was taken by the British in this case in the 17th century. And the Spanish had, they tried to use the native people as slaves, but for various reasons, it just didn't work. One reason was that the local people were very fierce and fought back against them, so there was war. And the other reason is that they were very susceptible to diseases which the white people brought with them, so that even something like a common cold could kill hundreds or thousands of people. They didn't have resistance to those diseases. And so the British kind of carried on in the same way as the Spanish had been. They had white plantation owners, they had African slaves, and they produced cotton, tobacco, and sugar, and goods of that kind. And really, pretty much from the beginning, the number of slaves was bigger than the number of colonialists or colonizers. So that at the end of the 18th century, you've got about 20,000 white people, 10,000 free people of color, that's black or mixed race people who are not slaves, and you've got 250,000 slaves in Jamaica. So, the vast majority of the population were black slaves, more than 10 times the number of white people. And sugar was the main crop during the 18th century. During the 19th century that changed, and bananas started to become more of a crop. One of the reasons it changed was because a lot of the free slaves didn't want to continue working as labourers in those plantations, and they wanted to set up their own communities just growing small amounts of food for their own village or their own family, their own community. So they just wanted to kind of get away from the white masters. And so at this stage, workers were brought in from other areas, so that today the Caribbean has quite a large number of people from Asian origin who were brought in by the British. Amazing how the British have moved populations of people around the world. Okay, Asian people in the Caribbean, black people in the Caribbean, and many other movements of people are there because the British we need people here. So they just shifted thousands and thousands of people across the planet. And these were slave societies, so the relationship would be very much more clearly master and slave rather than master and servant, which was the situation in India. These people were slaves. They were kept completely kept down. Of course, by Dickens's time, slavery had been declared illegal and had been abolished. But even in the late 19th century, you've still got a lot of sugar plantations that are relying on black labour. The labourers are not slaves, but they're still, in an inferior position in that society. And finally, Africa. Africa was the big one that was kind of happening, during the Victorian period. India, Jamaica, these things had happened before, but Africa was sort of happening as Dickens was living. There'd only been a few little trading posts along the West African coast, and Britain didn't have much interest in Africa before that. There wasn't much to be interested in. I mean, it was impenetrable jungle, or it was desert, or it was in other ways not attractive. The only area that was a little bit different was the South Africa, the very southern part of Africa. Nelson Mandela, the country that Nelson Mandela became president of. Okay, sometimes in Japanese, there's a difference between Africa no Minami and Minami Africa. Okay, South Africa is a country at the tip of Africa. It's this was the exception. The Dutch and the British were fighting for control of that area. It was the richest, it was the best climate, it had diamonds. Okay? That was a big attraction. And so once the slave trade was made illegal in 1807, the merchant adventurers turned their attention to the inside of Africa and started exploring territory that, until before that, had not really been attractive. But, you know, disease was a big problem. Okay, things like malaria from mosquitoes and those kinds of diseases, tsetse fly and things like that. Aggressive, hostile local inhabitants, okay, who were not going to welcome you in many cases. And of course, the land itself, desert, swamps, jungle, it was difficult for people to gain access. And there's this very famous explorer, David Livingstone, and he beat a trail into the heart of Africa, which sort of opened things up a bit for the British. And then in the 1870s, you get this scramble for Africa. Different European countries trying to control these large areas of the interior of Africa. And yes, once again, it's the Dutch who are kind of playing a big role in trying to win control, especially in South Africa, where they've got well-established communities called Boers. The Boers were the Dutch colonizers who had been there for a long time, and they were very clear they were not going to be pushed out by the British. And so this would be after Dickens's lifetime, of course, but there were these wars going on against the Dutch. One of the things, I mean, quite a lot of things that you could sort of describe as Igirisu no Haji, you know, the slave trade in particular today. It's also true that the first concentration camps, like those that the Jewish people were put in by the Nazis in World War II, the first concentration camps were set up by the British against the Boers in the late 19th century. And also, the British got a kind of shock from the Zulu people in South Africa. The Zulus were very strong fighters. And the British never imagined, oh, we're much more powerful than them. We have much better weapons. We're much more advanced. They can't fight against us. They're just savages. Well, they were shocked when they found that they actually lost to the Zulus. They did fight back and win, but they were shocked to find that they couldn't always win in those situations. So you've got some famous Zulu battles, which I'll show a picture of in a minute. Livingstone being carried through the jungle, it makes it look like he's just sort of being carried because he's a white man and but he can't just walk, but actually he was sick. Okay, so it's part of the reason why he's being carried there. And yeah, you've got the British, the Zulus here defeating the British, and there were uprisings going on in other parts of the empire. It was not all just sort of peaceful or passive acceptance. There was resistance in the Caribbean, in India. There were revolts against the empire in various places. This idea that it was a century of peace is only true for the people inside Britain. There was, after Napoleon and the threat of Napoleon attacking England, after Napoleon in the early part of the 19th century, after he's defeated, there's no threat there's no threat to the British people until World War I, really, 1914. So that's called a century of peace. But abroad, the British were fighting all the time in their empire against revolts of various kinds, against uprisings and protests of local people, battles for control of territory and so on. It's only a century of peace for the Victorian people at home. It wasn't a century of peace around the world for the British. Finally then, let's look at how the empire plays out in the literature of the time, and there's surprisingly little. In the early modern period, going back to the 16th century, you've got Richard Hakluyt describing the discovery of America. You've got Shakespeare, actually, I haven't mentioned him here, but you've got Shakespeare's The Tempest, which is actually early 17th century, but Shakespeare's The Tempest is also seen as a kind of allegory of colonialism. You've got, later on in the 17th century, you've got things like Afraben's Orinoco, set in South America, but it's quite an exceptional sort of book. There's not much like that. She was an unusual person. I mean, she was a woman. She was writing at that time. There weren't many women writing in the 17th century. If you're interested, you should take a look at her. She's unusual. Okay, and if the stories about her life are true, she actually spent part of her childhood in Suriname. So it's not clear if she actually lived there herself, but she certainly writes about it in a very interesting way, with quite a lot of sympathy for those people who are under the white control, and showing their kind of nobility or bravery and so on. So it's an interesting work. But there's not very much. There are some very, very big gaps. Okay, I mean, one reason for that would be that these people who are living that life, their main job is kind of staying alive. Right? It wasn't easy living in those colonies. They're too busy staying alive to write books about it or to keep much written record. But during the 18th century, there are very few narratives of empire. You've got Defoe's Robinson Crusoe, but that's not really empire, it's a castaway. He's on a desert island. Okay, yes, you do get native people coming from another place, but it does show, yes, I'm British. Robinson Crusoe is British, he's English. So he's naturally the leader or the ruler over Man Friday, who's kind of symbolizes the colonized person. But it's not really it doesn't really give us much insight into the world of those colonies in those days. Swift's Gulliver's Travels, again, it's a satirical fantasy. It's not really focused on empire in the way that we might expect. And moving on into the late 18th, early 19th centuries, you've got the Gothic novels, which, again, they were often set in distant lands, but not really in a realistic way. Just some kind of fushigi, mysterious, distant country where we can write about all kinds of fantasies and magic and mysterious things. Not really getting into the realities of the society or colonialism. There are travel books, which, especially in the Victorian period, you get quite a lot of, especially women, okay, who travelled around to some of these colonies and wrote some fascinating accounts. Again, if you're interested, I'll be happy to give some more information about that. I didn't put it on the presentation here. But the classic novels of the 19th century, basically nearly all of them just focus on life in Britain. And the empire is only hinted at, in various kind of shadowy ways. You get Mr. Rochester in Charlotte Bronte's Jane Eyre, he owns land in Jamaica. He's married to a mixed race Creole woman from Jamaica. But the story itself is it's all set in England. And his wife never actually speaks. We never hear her story. She's just the mad woman in the attic, as a very famous essay describes her. She's just the mad woman in the attic. She has no voice. And the empire, to a large extent during this period, seems to have no voice. We don't hear, we want to hear those people speak. And their voices, to a large extent, have been silenced. Or were never printed, never published, were not made available. It's only in the later part of the 19th century and the early part of the 20th century that you start to get writers who make the empire their main focus. Rudyard Kipling, Rider Haggard, and Joseph Conrad would be the three most famous. Kipling focusing on India, which he knew very well, lived for much of his life in India. Rider Haggard and Conrad focusing on Africa. And they really are setting their stories in those environments. They are showing the empire and the colonial relationship that the white people had with the societies of those countries. Here we get a much clearer sort of picture. I didn't mention Thackeray, but I could have mentioned Thackeray from the Victorian period. He perhaps talks a little bit more directly, but basically it's the absence of direct mention of the empire that strikes us when we look at 19th century literature. Rather than the representation of it, it's the absence of it. There's so little said about it, just little hints. Okay, and we're left wondering, we're left guessing. Some of these very rich people that are being written about in these novels, where are they getting their money? Okay, we're not very often told directly. Okay, so finding the little hints and interpreting the hints is one of the fascinating aspects of studying 19th century literature. So I would encourage you to kind of look at that, and perhaps that might make a good topic for somebody for a term paper. Okay, well that about winds it up. That's it for the empire.